Yaron Brook, welcome to the Brothers on Books podcast.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
So let's get right into the crux of the issue. In your own words, can you summarize what the Israeli-Palestinian conflict actually is?
just just like in 2 minutes, and yes, I mean, basically, the conflict is that Jews immigrated to a part of the Middle East in which they established a westernized, civilized, free country. And the former inhabitants of that land and the people that inhabit the lands surrounding it, from the beginning, resented that fact and fought against it and committed acts of violence against these immigrants and then against the establishment of a state, and have perpetrated war against Israel since then. So for 100 years, there's basically been conflict between Arabs and Jews because Jews wanted to establish a civilized, free country in a tiny piece of land in the midst of an Arab population that occupies the Middle East. And this country's been unbelievably successful, unbelievably prosperous, unbelievably, certainly relative to its neighbors, but even relative to the rest of the world, free. And that has only led to more resentment and more hatred because it succeeded. And we hate success and we love failure. So we like the Palestinians, we hate the Israelis. It's really quite simple.
You mean we as like a Western society, right? Hate
Yeah, we in
success.
Western
Yeah.
society, we jump all over anybody who's suffering. We think they're wonderful, and anybody who's successful. I mean, you get this at universities, right? The oppressor-oppressed model. If you're successful, then you must be an oppressor, and if you're a failure and you're poor and you're miserable and you're struggling, you must be oppressed. It can't be that one party actually did the right thing and actually produced wealth and actually used their mind, pursued rational values, and created something and built something and became successful. It can't be that the people who are poor made poor choices and actually are responsible for their own misery. That cannot be. We don't accept that kind of agency anymore. We just look at the outcome and we assign blame or responsibility based on outcomes. I mean, this is the whole agenda of the left today, but it has a long, long history in the past, going back to Christianity. The poor are virtuous by the very fact that they are poor.
Can you walk us through or illustrate a little bit before Israel was formed in 1948 and then after? Because, I mean, one of the arguments you always hear is, well, the Jews like stole the land.
Yeah, but that's nonsense, right? So starting in the late 19th century, Jews start to immigrate to Palestine, first in small numbers. During this period, the Ottoman Empire rules over Palestine. So it is part of an empire. There's no state there. There's no Palestine. The Ottomans, the district under which Palestine is part of, is ruled out of Syria. And the Ottomans are there. And when the Jews move there, they buy land. They buy land from landowners who may be a part of the Ottoman Empire in Syria or in Damascus or in Istanbul or wherever. They buy land from local families or local landowners, but they buy land. They have no ability to steal the land because the Ottomans wouldn't let them, right? So they buy the land, and they often buy land that nobody wants. So they occupy swamps and they dry the swamps, right? These are entrepreneurial people who are committed to building something new, and they do amazing things in this land. They might buy pieces of the desert and cultivate it and prove that you can grow stuff in the desert. Tel Aviv was established, if I remember right, 1907 or 1908, on sand, on the beach, not far from an existing population center called Jaffa, but Tel Aviv, there's nothing there. There's just sand. It's on a beach. but the land is purchased, it's bought, and a city is built on it, and it's a new city. And if you go there today, it's a unbelievably thriving city. So that happens under the Ottoman Empire. During World War I, the Ottomans make the foolish choice of siding with Germany and siding with that alliance, which lands up losing. And they fight the British. The British are in the Middle East, and the British basically occupy all of the Ottoman Empire's holdings in the Middle East. So Britain lands up with Palestine, as well as vast areas of what today is Jordan and Syria and Iraq and parts of Saudi Arabia, and all of that is basically British. And they have to decide what to do with it, because they realize at this point the British Empire is in decline already, and they realize they need to do something with this land. Quite a bit of lobbying is happening in London. Jews are, for a variety of reasons, which we can get to if you want. Jews would like a homeland. They'd like to settle somewhere. They are convinced that they don't have a future in Europe, that the Europeans are going to turn against them and kill them all. Turns out that they were right. And so they lobby the British to let them have a state in Palestine, which is kind of their ancestral, ancient home. So it makes some sense. The British say, yeah, we got this land. There are not a lot of people there. Sure, why not? We'll give it to you. And there's a Balfour Declaration, 1917, that basically gives them the entire area of Palestine. Actually, it gives them Transjordan, which is Palestine plus what today is Jordan. But they renege on that very quickly. They also promise, I don't know, Saudi Arabia to two different families, and then they have to decide which family to give Saudi Arabia to. The Sauds in the end, and then the other family they give Jordan to, and one brother gets Jordan and the other brother gets Syria, but the Syrians don't like him, so then they give him Iraq. So this is great power trying to structure the Middle East. Remember that historically there's no such thing as Jordan, there's no such thing as Iraq, there's no such thing as Syria. These countries came into existence after World War I, and there's never, ever, ever been such a thing as Palestine, right? Palestine's always been ruled, that area of land, by some empire. The last people who independently had a state on Palestine were the Jews over 2,000 years ago. But since then, it's been Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Byzantines, take your pick. It's always been some empire. Anyway, 1917, the British occupying it from the end of World War I onwards. And so there's great Jewish immigration into there. Again, they're buying land. They're buying land from a lot of the Palestinian families that today hate Israel. They made money selling land to Jews. And there's no controversy over this. I mean, you can go to the land registry of the Ottoman Empire or the British Mandate, and you can find all the records. A lot of the money being used to buy this land was provided by rich Jews in Europe, Rothschilds and other banking families that had a lot of money. They basically purchased a lot of land in Israel. So this is going on really from the late 19th century. The Arab neighbors don't like this, so they attack the Jewish settlements. They kill Jews on a regular basis. There are big riots in 1921 where Jews are massacred and killed. There's a huge Arab uprising in 1936 that lasts 3 years against the British and against the Jews, where, again, Jews are massacred. By this point, the Jews are starting to organize some kind of semblance of military to try to protect themselves, and in anticipation of one day the British will leave and we'll have a state. In 1939, Britain basically reneges on the Balfour Declaration, basically says to Palestinians, look, we'll give you basically 80% of the land, 70% of the land. We'll give tiny little bit of piece to the Jews. And that was basically saying, no, British out. We want to, we basically are going to kill the Jews, and we're going to take 100% of the land. So the British stay, and World War II, of course, breaks out. And then, by 1947, the Brits have had it. They want out. The empire, again, is crumbling. India is going to be independent soon, and they've got a mess everywhere else, and they want out of Palestine. Both the Jews and the Arabs are attacking them. They're getting killed over there. There's no upside for them. So they basically they say, we can't settle this. There's no solution. So they go to the United Nations and they say, you guys handle it, right? We don't know what to do. So the United Nations basically has a commission. The commission goes out and they investigate and they talk to everybody. And they come back and they say, look, we should divide the land into two: Palestinian state, Israeli Jewish state. I mean, if you've ever seen the maps of that, it's the Jewish parts are kind of fragmented, the Arab parts are fragmented. They're trying to focus on population centers. Most of the land they're giving to the Jews is the south. It's the Negev, which is all desert. And they vote on it. And in the UN General Assembly, it's voted on, and the proposition wins. And that night, Jews go out and celebrate. They've got a state. This is great. The UN has approved it. Parties and everything. They're not happy with the land they got, but it's fine. They'll take it. The next day, the Arabs attack. The Palestinians start attacking Jewish settlements. They attack a bus full of civilians and they kill them. And basically a war inside Israel starts between the Palestinians and the Jews. As a consequence of this war, many the Jews win or are winning. And while they are winning, many Palestinians decide to leave. They take their belongings and they hike out of there, partially because Arab countries like Egypt and Jordan and Syria are telling them, look, as soon as the British are out, we're going to invade and we're going to take all this back. When we do, you can come back. Leave now, clear stuff out so they know not too many civilian casualties. So they do. They leave. They leave in large quantities. About 600,000 of them over 1948 and 49 leave. Look, some of them, about 10 to 15%, are kicked out by the Israelis for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's because the location where they live is strategic. Sometimes it's, these people have been fighting and attacking Jews, and the Jewish commanders just say, enough's enough. Leave. We don't want you here. Just go. So about 15% of them are literally kicked out. Some mostly justifiably. Is everything justified? No, I'm sure there were things that happened were not justified. Did civilians get killed gratuitously by the Jews? Probably on occasion. Did the Arabs kill a lot of Jewish civilians gratuitously? Absolutely. And nobody questions that. That's fascinating. The massacres that the Arabs commit against Jews, nobody ever questions, because that's kind of expected. When the Jews, if there's a massacre of Jews of civilians, that is a big deal. That violates everything. So anyway, in 1948, in May 1948, the British leave. Israel declares independence. 7 Arab armies invade. Basically Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Libya, I think sent some troops. They all invade. They land up losing. Israel lands up actually gaining ground over what the UN had given it. There's an armistice in 1949, kind of a ceasefire, not a peace deal, kind of ceasefire. In the meantime, 600,000 Palestinians have left their homes. And Israel in 1949 makes an offer to take back 100,000 of them in exchange for a peace deal, in exchange for some kind of long-term settlement. And the Arabs say, no, no way. And Israel says, well, fine, and they're not coming back. They started a war against us. They lost. We can't have that many people coming back and being a kind of a force within our country that wants to destroy us. So that's 49. Since then, basically, we've had a war in 56, a war in 67, where Israel so the Gaza Strip, which is in the news, of course, today, and the West Bank. The Gaza Strip was occupied by Egypt post 1949, and the West Bank was occupied by Jordan post 1949. And in neither case did anybody discuss having a Palestinian state. In neither case did Jordan offer the Palestinians a Palestinian state in the West Bank or the Egyptians in Gaza. It was assumed in those days Arab nationalism was big, and it was assumed that we're all Arabs, we're all going to have one big state, we're all going to unite somehow. And there was nationalism qua a limited a nation state for Palestinians was not a big deal. That only became an issue I'd say in the 1960s, became a real issue about a Palestinian state, this idea. But it was always in the context of, we'll have a Palestinian state after we kick out the Jews, right? We'll kill all the Jews, or we'll send them on boats somewhere. And then once we occupy the whole land, then we'll establish a Palestinian state. Anyway, 1967, there was a war. Israel occupied the whole of Sinai, including Gaza. It occupied the West Bank, and a war of self-defense. It was clearly a war of aggression of the Arabs, and it occupied the Golan Heights in Syria. And since then, there's been a peace treaty with Egypt. As a consequence of that, Israel gave back the Sinai. They wanted to give back Gaza, but the Egyptians really didn't want it. So Israel kept Gaza. In the meantime, during this period, Jews settled inside Gaza. So inside Gaza, there were Jewish settlements sprinkled throughout Gaza. The West Bank, same thing. There's no peace deal, nobody to take it back. At this point, Jordan decided, we don't want it. There should be a Palestinian state in the West Bank. And of course, Israel still occupies the Golan Heights because Syria has never been open to negotiating a peace deal. At the same time, a Palestinian kind of terrorist culture evolved, and a Palestinian, was called the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, but there was also a lot of different spin-offs, mostly funded by the Soviet Union. Those of you who remember, or too young to remember, can read in history books about all the terrorist attacks in the 60s and 70s against Israel, including the murder of the Israeli athletes in Munich, which made big headlines. So this continued. Israel cut a deal with Yasser Arafat, who was the leader of the PLO in 1994. It's called the Oslo Accord, by which Palestinians will get autonomy and ultimately a state. As soon as Yasser Arafat came back to the West Bank, he was in Tunisia at the time. Violence ensued, terrorist attacks against Israel ensued. Ultimately, there was Camp David with Bill Clinton and Bill Clinton and what's his name, Yasser Arafat, and Ehud Barak, which was the Israeli prime minister at the time. And basically, Israel offered the Palestinians what pretty much everybody agrees is 95% of everything they wanted. They got most of their land. The only thing they didn't get is the right of return, i.e., the Palestinian refugees around the world couldn't come back to Israel. They could come back to Palestinian new state, but they couldn't come into Israel and resettle. Yasser Arafat turned it down, said absolutely not. Went back to the West Bank and started what today is called the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada involved suicide bombings, massive slaughter, almost on a weekly basis. A bus, a restaurant, a wedding had a suicide bomber walk in and explode and kill people. There was like an equivalent of a 9/11 every few months. I mean, it was just brutal and massive slaughter and just horrific. And it lasted for like four years, from 2000 to 2004, something like that. In 2005, Israel decided two things. One, it allowed Yasser Arafat died, and it allowed the Palestinians to have an election, but being pushed by Bush administration wanted them to have an election. Israel didn't want Hamas to participate because Hamas doesn't recognize the existence of Israel. It is an anti-democratic, anti-Israel organization. And Israel said, you can have an election, but no Hamas. Bush administration said, you can't do that. Everybody participates. You have to allow Hamas to run. Israel said, okay, we'll do what Americans want. They had an election. Hamas won the election on a platform of the destruction of the state of Israel. When they won the election, everybody was surprised. They shouldn't have been, but they were. And the Palestinian Authority was not about to give up power, the PLO, and basically a civil war between Hamas and the PLO started. And at the end of that civil war, basically, the West Bank belonged to the Palestinian Authority, PLO, and Gaza belonged to Hamas. And Hamas slaughtered everybody in the PLO that objected to this in Gaza, and they killed them all. in the middle of this, Israel decided it was leaving Gaza. So it literally dismantled all the settlements it had had in Gaza by force, forced the people out of there, and said, Gaza is all yours, Palestinians. Do with it what you want. And the idea was that it was too difficult to run Gaza. It was too difficult to manage it. There were too many terrorist attacks. It was too difficult to protect these settlements. If they left, then the idea was they could always come back in with force and eradicate any threat that they observed. Anyway, Hamas came to rule. Hamas established an authoritarian, dictatorial police state in Gaza. They accepted billions of dollars from the West, from America, from Qatar, from Iran, from everybody. They didn't build Hong Kong on the Mediterranean. Instead, they built tunnels, they bought weapons. They launched rockets into Israel on a regular basis. Israel would go in a little bit, punish them a little bit, and then retreat. They came to the conclusion Israel was weak. And this tit for tat has been going on since 2007, when they had full control, back and forth, back and forth. Israel didn't take it seriously, didn't do what was necessary to dismantle them. On the other end, and Hamas kept attacking Israel. And then, of course, October 7th happened, and I guess we know what happened for this. So there is a 15-minute history of Israel. I'm sure there were a lot of holes and a lot of things I didn't mention, but that's inevitable.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty good. I just had a quick, question on your own take. But so the initiation of how the Israeli settlers got the original land is, I was always told what you just said is that they bought it. But I feel like, I listened to you debate Saifuddin not too long ago, and when I listened to other, pro-Palestinian people talk, it's this almost obsession with like the land was stolen. But maybe the context is in some way different, because I'm like very confused if you don't own the land. Like I'm just envisioning myself, if I'm renting a house and the landlord sells the house and the new owner tells me to get out, like I would leave. Like I wouldn't have some,
So here's the confusion. In 1948, when Israel, or 1947, when hostilities really become intense, Jews don't own a lot of the land in Israel, right? They own very little. Most of the land in Israel is not owned by anybody, right? It used to be owned by the Ottoman Empire, right? Because just like in the United States, west of the Mississippi, 75% of the land is owned by the state, not by private owners. So most of the land in what is Israel was owned by the state. The Ottoman Empire, the British mandate, whatever. It wasn't owned by any specific individual, right? So it's no man's land. And then a bunch of stuff was owned by Arabs, and some stuff was owned by Jews. And nobody disputes, even Saif didn't dispute that Jews bought the land before 1947. All that land was bought. He completely acknowledged that. But then the question is, first, if Israel gets established as a state, does the Israeli government then take over all the land that is not owned by anybody, that is state-owned, that is the British mandates or the Ottoman empires? And of course, I mean, that's how it always is. That land is not Arab land because it has some mystical Arab thing going on. That land is not owned by anybody. And when a state is established, the state takes over it. Now, I believe all property should be private property. So Israel should have done a homesteading act or immediately sold that land to private enterprise or whatever. But that's Israel, right? It's a relatively socialist country. It's very Western. Even in the United States, as I said, 75% Western Mississippi is owned by government, state, local, or federal government. Now, what happens to the Arab land of Arabs who ran away during the war, abandoned it? These Arabs who initiated force or supported those who initiated force, or just abandoned the land because there was a war. And now at the end of the war, the land is abandoned. That is the real question. Now, my view is you initiate force, you lose your right to the land, and, somebody else is going to take it. Somebody else is going to take it and use it. You're gone. you've given up, and you've given up tied up by the land by leaving in the middle of a war. I think this is pretty conventional all over the world. When the Czechs and the Poles kicked out Germans after World War II, I don't know if you know this, but millions of Germans were kicked out of Poland and kicked out of Czechoslovakia after World War II, and returned and said, "Go to Germany. That's where you belong. We don't want you here after the war. We don't want you." Their land wasn't returned to them later on. Czechs occupied the land, and that was it, right? And they don't have a claim many generations later over that land any more than, if Jews go to Poland, the Poles always look at them suspiciously as if they're coming to reclaim their property that was stolen from them in World War II. It's just not happening. Nobody's reclaiming ancient land. So they abandoned the land, and that land was occupied by Israelis. And if the Arabs who stayed, the Arabs who didn't run away, their land is protected by property rights. So the question is, one, what happens to the land that's not owned by anybody by deed? Well, that becomes state land, and that's not stolen. That's just the way it is, right? The only real question that you could debate is what happens to the land of people who abandon it. And in my view, if you start a war and you abandon your land, you've forfeited it, and whoever can use it better takes control out of it and owns it. And the people who claim the Jews stole the land are just lying. They're just wrong, and they know they're wrong. But they're twisting they're twisting these concepts because they know that this land was abandoned, and they're trying to say, well, they should have been allowed after the war to come back. Not after you started a war, and not after there's no peace agreement, and not after you're still saying you want to kill all the Jews and you want to drive them into the sea. There's no way I'm bringing you back and allowing you to settle amongst my population. That's just self-defense.
So when Israel left Gaza in 2005, like the wall, did that wall get built after 2005? And then can you kind of
it's not a wall, it's a fence. And it wasn't a very good fence, because you saw on October 7th how they ran right through it. But yeah, look, remember in 2005, the Second Intifada was just ending. The Second Intifada was a consequence of Gazans and Arabs from the West Bank driving into Israel, or walking into Israel, or taking a bus into Israel, and then strapped with explosives, blowing stuff up. Israel couldn't allow that to continue, so they built fences. In the West Bank, they built a wall. I don't like walls, but they built them in order to try to control terrorists coming into the country and blowing stuff up. When I lived I left Israel in 1987. During the 1980s, Palestinians were in Israel all the time. Well over 1 million Palestinians slept in Israel every night, except on the weekends they'd go home. They were the construction workers. They worked in restaurants. They were everywhere. And everything was fine, right? It's the Second Intifada and even before the Second Intifada, when they were starting to commit terrorist attacks, when they were in Israel, Israel decided to separate it out and to protect itself. So yes, it built a wall around Gaza and basically said, you can't come here anymore unless you have a permit, unless we screen you. And tens of thousands of Gazans came into Israel every day to work, even up until October 7th. Some of the people who came into Israel to work participated in the October 7th. So I don't think that's ever happening again. But it is, yeah. So the fences and the protective stuff all went up once in order to protect Israel from violence emanating from Gaza.
So you said in the 80s, it didn't seem like what you were just saying, there weren't really these problems of violence. I guess, what do you think changed from, I guess, the 80s to the early 2000s that caused, I guess, these terror attacks to start popping up?
I think two things. One is, which is Israel's fault. One is that there was no solution, right? So this worked, but it wasn't really a long-term solution, right? Here was a large population. They weren't Israeli citizens. They were working in Israel and slept in Israel. They'd go home, but they weren't citizens, and there wasn't a plan. There wasn't some, okay, what do we do about this? How do we fix it? And then when there was a plan, the plan was a rotten one. It was a really, really bad one. So I think Israel could have solved the problem in the 70s and 80s and probably established a Palestinian state, negotiated with people in the West Bank and Gaza, and cut a deal. I think. I'm not convinced, but I think. The real mistake, the big strategic mistake, was in the early 1990s, and this is all pressure from outside, European pressure, American pressure. Israel, instead of negotiating with people in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, negotiated with Yasser Arafat. Now, Yasser Arafat was a monster, was a brutal, child-killing, blood on his hands monster, a real terrorist. And Israel decided to negotiate with him about the Palestinians' future. One of the most chilling and most disgusting photos ever is Rabin and Yasser Arafat with who was the president in '94? It was Bill Clinton, standing on the White House lawn, shaking hands. I mean, that I find despicable. This guy, deserved nothing less than death. And instead, they cut a deal with him. As soon as Yasser Arafat came back to the West Bank, violence started. That's his modus operandi. That's what he did. He was a terrorist. So as soon as he came back to the West Bank in the mid 90s, he started organizing terrorist attacks against Israel. And what would happen is he'd negotiate with the Israelis, and when the Israelis were tough, the terrorism would stop. And when the Israelis were giving in, when the Israelis were weak, he perceived them as weak, terrorism was increased. So, like everything in history, this is always the case. Weakness promotes terrorism. When in 1999, Israel gave 95% to the Palestinians, that's when terrorism really escalated through the roof. Because they figured if they do a little bit more terrorism, a little bit more bloodshed, they'll get the extra 5%. It's always weakness. But look, the reality is that those are two elements. There's one other element that I should mention. And that is that in the late 1980s, Hamas came into being. Hamas was a product of the Muslim Brotherhood of Palestine, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a Islamist organization out of Egypt. They had a branch in Palestine, but they would always been peaceful and advocating through education. And then they established Hamas, which was going to be much more violent and radical. Before the Muslim Brotherhood really became successful, I would say the Palestinian people were probably the most secular Arabs in the Arab world. They were very secular. They weren't religious at all. Hamas really converted people to radical Islam, to really take Islam seriously. And over the years, and you see that today, they have turned a relatively secular people into a really, really religious people committed to jihad, committed to Islam, and willing to die for Islam. So those are the three elements: Israel's inability to cut a deal with the locals, their willingness to cut a deal with Yasser Arafat, who represents violence and death and destruction, and the rise of Hamas. And the rise of Hamas, the reality is, part of Israel's mistake was, because it thought the Muslim Brotherhood would be peaceful, they actually supported Hamas in the early days because they believe it would be a good counterbalance to Yasser Arafat's secular terrorist Marxist organization. So they regretted it very quickly when they realized what they'd done. But the rise of religion has brought immense amounts of violence to Israel.
If you were to analyze why Israel chose to negotiate with Arafat over the locals in Gaza and the West Bank, like, how would you analyze that? Like, why is it just easier to,
I'd say most of it was international pressure, just like you're seeing today. Why is Israel negotiating with Hamas? Principle number one of any book on terrorism, including the one Netanyahu wrote years ago, is you don't negotiate with terrorists. Why are they negotiating with them? Because the world puts massive amounts of pressure on them. Now, they do have, they still have over 100 hostages, although most of them are almost assuredly dead by now. But the negotiation is basically massive amounts of pressure from the outside and some pressure from the inside. Yasser Arafat was portrayed by the West as a great liberator, as a freedom fighter. It was like, if you're going to cut a deal, and it's also possible that when Israel tried to negotiate with people locally, the local people were afraid. They basically said, if we negotiate with you, the PLO will kill us. So we're not going to. So it could be that Israel tried and failed. I don't know enough about the details of that. But Yasser Arafat ruled over the Palestinians with terror. And Arafat was considered among the various terrorist organizations that represented the Palestinian people. Arafat was considered the more moderate one. So maybe that was part of it. I don't know why. I don't know why nobody learns from history. You can't negotiate with monsters. You can't negotiate with evil. You always lose. Evil wins, you lose. You'd think we'd learned after thousands of years of this kind of stuff, but we don't. We have to try it all over again every single time. Now everybody wants Ukraine to negotiate with Putin. It's the same thing. It's the same principle. You can't negotiate with Putin. There's nothing that Putin can give you that doesn't already belong to you, right? And it's the same with Hamas, and it's the same with Arafat, and it's the same. That is, so Israel compromised, as it always does, as it is right now with Hamas, and as a consequence, people die.
So I guess in that line, I recently listened to your lecture, like the morality of war, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and I was getting. I mean, you gave that talk probably, at least on YouTube. It was uploaded like at least 10 years ago.
I gave this talk 20 years ago, a few years after 9/11. Yeah.
Okay. I guess the video was uploaded a little late.
Yeah. Well, there was no YouTube when I gave the talk. YouTube did not exist at that point.
But I guess it seems just as relevant today as it would have been then. But
it would be it's going to be relevant in 100 years. I hope. I mean, it's a good talk, so it's relevant. It basically lays out the principles of how you fight a war and how you fight to win, assuming you're the good guys, right? So in a war between good guys and bad guys, how you fight it? And I think those are timeless principles.
Real quick, can you I thought this was very important. Can you define like how you define good and bad?
Yeah, I mean, good is that which supports human life. So regimes, for example, that support human life, which basically are regimes that are free, that respect free speech, that have some protection of property rights, that have free political systems, they're generally good. Regimes that are authoritarian, totalitarian, where there is no free speech and no political opposition, where a ruler can basically decide the fate of anybody in his country arbitrarily, those are evil. So, if you look at the world today, as much as I'm critical of everything the Biden administration does or the Trump administration did, America is a good country. China, not so good. Russia, even worse than China. Arab world, mostly bad. Nothing really good there. There's no really caring for human flourishing, and there's no caring for individual liberty. There's no caring for property rights or respect for free speech. Unfortunately, most of the unfree world, which is the Arab world and parts of Africa and China and Russia, they are bad regimes, and some of them downright evil regimes. And the Western world, which includes Israel, Europe, the United States, I don't know, places like South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Singapore, are basically good. Singapore is a mixed case because it has some significant economic freedoms, but it also has some limitations in economic freedom as well. But the rest are pretty good. Now, none of the good countries are perfect. None of the good countries are as good as I would like them to be. None of them respect individual rights as much as I would want them to. But they are basically good because they support individual human life. And Afghanistan doesn't. And Syria doesn't. And Iraq and Iran don't. And Iran not only doesn't respect its own citizens' rights, you can see that with the girls demonstrating against being forced to cover their hair and to wear certain clothes. But you can see it in Iran's funding of terrorism and attempts to kill people everywhere around the world to the extent that it can. Iran is an evil regime. It is one of the most evil regimes on the planet.
So I guess the reason I brought that up is in the talk you were saying like if you're gonna fight a war, you have to fight it to win, and that entails like essentially destruction of your enemy. So I guess you bring up, you know, how we made Japan and Germany stop World War II with just an extreme show of force. I guess, do you think with sort of what you were touching on earlier with how, I guess, radicalized, I guess the Palestinians have come, like with Islamic doctrine, do you think an extreme show of force would make them stop fighting?
I think it's the only thing that will make them stop fighting. I don't think there's anything else. I mean, you know, the Palestinians are as radicalized around Islam as the Germans were radicalized again around Nazism, and the Japanese were radicalized around, you know, Japanese mystic fascism. They all had an ideology they believed in, you know, without any constraints until they lost. But they lost thoroughly, completely, unequivocally. The problem with what's happening in Israel today is the Palestinians are not losing thoroughly, unequivocally. They're losing a battle here, a battle there, but they hold on to hope that they can win one day. And they continue to hold on to that hope. And they will continue to hold on to that hope as long as Israel is being constrained by the West, and Israel is constraining itself in how it fights. I mean, it's been 7 months. This war should have been over in less than a month. You know, shock and awe and a level of destruction the Palestinians have never seen. And they should have just been on their knees and finished within a month. But Israel is so careful not to kill anybody. And as a consequence of being careful, all that has gained Israel, the thing that Israel has won over by doing that is the hatred of the world. You know, by Israel being super careful not to kill civilians, now the prime minister and the defense secretary are going to be tried, you know, in the International Criminal Court in The Hague for war crimes. You know, imagine if they'd really done it. You know, if they'd done what they were accused of. You know, throughout the war, they've been supplying them with food and with electricity and with internet connection. And, you know, this is like, is this really fighting a war? I mean, what are we doing here? Are we playing games? Or are we serious about this? And Israel's playing games. I mean, this is not serious. You know, Israel needed to engage in far greater destruction than it did, and it needed to do it much faster. It needed to have the war over very quickly, because the longer the war lasts, the longer the world will hate. The longer the world develops that hatred, it reminds itself of, oh yeah, we're supposed to hate those people, and that's exactly what happened. I predicted it the day the war broke out, and as soon as it looked like Israel was going to hesitate and take its time. You can't win wars like this. It's never happened in history. The Romans didn't win wars like this. The Christians, when they won, didn't win wars like this. And certainly the history of the West is of overwhelming force, crushing the enemy. And that ends it. That ends the war, the crushing of the enemy. And Israel's not crushing. It's winning, but it's not crushing. You have to crush.
Sorry,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, do you think they'll come around and use the necessary force or no?
No. You know, this is going to end somehow. There'll be some negotiated thing. Israel will draw. Maybe there'll be a peacekeeping force in Gaza. At some point, the Palestinians will rise up against the peacekeeping force, and they'll leave, and everything will go back to the same it was before.
So
I mean, there's no way it doesn't happen that way.
So if you would have been in charge, are we talking like nukes, like very quickly? Is that kind of the type of
Well, you
force
can't
you're
use
talking?
nukes. You can't use nukes because it's so small.
Proximity. Yeah, that's kind of, yeah, I thought
It's
that's
a
why
tiny
they,
place. You can't use nukes. But yeah, significant bombing, massive troops entry. Sadly, I said the day after that they just have to assume the hostages are dead. You can't run a war, afraid to bomb because you might kill your own people. It's just that, collateral damage is part of the deal. It's part of reality. And they should have gone in, and they should have gone in 2 days after. I hear that they didn't have plans, which I find mind-boggling. I mean, I was in military intelligence in Israel, in the Israeli military, and we had plans for all kinds of stuff, right? For all kinds of contingencies. The idea that they had to suddenly draw plans, I mean, there's negligence here is unbelievable. But going fast, quick, and in a devastating way, so as the Palestinians just don't know what hit them, and really put them in a state of shock and awe. The world would have gone apoplectic, but they were still kind of they still felt for the Israelis because of October 7th. So maybe it would have they wouldn't have quite realized what was going on, and then you're done with it, and then it's over, and then maybe there's some consequences afterwards. Maybe the world gets upset. Maybe the international court or whatever gets upset. But you won already, so it doesn't matter. Now it's in the middle of the war. You've got all this pressure. You've got European countries recognizing a Palestinian state now. I mean, now it's an avalanche against Israel, and there's almost no good outcome at this point that can happen. Politically, they're toast, and militarily, because they're so careful in what they do, and people don't realize this, the reason they haven't won this yet is because they're so careful and trying not to kill civilians. It's, I know the protocols, and the protocols when I was in the Army were a lot lower threshold. We, in the first, if I remember right, in the first 2 weeks of the 1982 Lebanon War, which I was part of, I think Israel killed 10,000 civilians in 2 weeks. In this war, which has lasted 7 months, maybe they've killed 15 to 20,000 civilians. So this is like one of the least number of civilian casualties in the history of warfare, particularly of urban warfare, that has ever happened. And what do they get for that? They get harassed and harangued and accused of crimes and everything. So if you're going to be accused of crimes anyway, you might as well win it properly and do whatever's necessary. And the reality is, I don't know how many people would have died if they'd gone in with full force. It might have been the same or fewer, because you go in with such overwhelming force, it ends much quicker. You don't drag it out over 7 months. It's not clear that more people have to die. It's like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? A lot of people died that day, but in the big picture, it wasn't that many, given that the United States had firebombed Tokyo, firebombed every major city in Japan. When they firebombed Tokyo, I think more people died there than Hiroshima. 1 million people were left homeless in Tokyo because of the firebombing in Tokyo. And if the United States had been forced to invade Japan, I mean, 2 million civilians would have died, far more, 10, 20 times more than what died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So even on a calculus of how many people die, it's sometimes better to be brutal up front, shockingly brutal up front, and end it quickly than drag it out and have, hundreds of thousands or millions of people die.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems to me like when I listen today to people today talk about war, they don't have the political will to essentially do what you're saying, which is what's necessary. Because I think, yeah, I mean, I've read what you just said. I've read reports that said, dropping the A-bomb saved hundreds of thousands of lives.
But I am accused of being a complete barbarian by libertarians like the ones you mentioned for advocating for dropping the Hiroshima bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, they claim that was a moral evil, not just people on the left, but people on the right and people among libertarians. And the reality is that people have no clue what war is, what it's like, what it entails. These are people who've never lived in a war zone, have never been in a war. They can't think about war because they live in some fantasy world of suburban America, and they don't know what the world is really like. And they have all been brought up with an altruistic Christian, secularized Christian morality that says self-sacrifice is a good thing. Love your enemy like yourself. Turn the other cheek. And today with intersectionality and all the nonsense of the left, basically the oppressor, the oppressed, the poor are the virtuous, and the successful are by definition oppressors, and therefore the bad guys. It's just such an inverted, crazy, detached from reality morality that basically demands that the good guys sacrifice themselves to the bad guys. And that's what the world wants. The world wants the good guys to sacrifice themselves to bad guys. And you see that everywhere. You see that in the cowering of Europeans to their Muslim immigrants, letting them get away with murder and not prosecute them, not applying European law to these new immigrants because, what do they know? That, we have to treat them nicely because, and we're guilty and we're the bad guys, and imperialism, remember those days, and colonialism, remember those days, and we should feel guilty about that. So we should now let the Muslims rampage all over Europe and not do anything about it. So it's this crazy morality of self-sacrifice that is killing the West. Ayn Rand said, we're dying from an orgy of altruism, and absolutely, and I don't think there's ever been a more blatant example of that altruism than American and European foreign policy right now with regard to Israel.
I mean, if your forecast, like the way you're talking, like, Israel left Gaza, I mean, if they keep putting up with these types of pressures, I mean, do you see Israel even existing in like 100 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think it exists, but it hasn't solved the problems. That it's still, for now, who knows? 100 years is a long time, and maybe better ideas take over. But Israel's got its own internal problems that it doesn't know how to solve. Right, the conflict between secular Jews and religious Jews in some senses a bigger problem than the Palestinians in terms of Israel's ability to exist long term. But I don't think Israel disappears. I think it just has a continued history of major bloodshed. Now, there is the possibility, of course, that, I don't know, the Saudis do really westernize, do really moderate and westernize even more than they have so far. And they just get fed up with the Palestinians and they say, okay, we'll occupy Gaza, we'll do something, or they team up with the Egyptians and the Saudis hand them a big check and the Egyptians take Gaza or something. I mean, there are alternative solutions. But the sad thing is that it doesn't seem like Israel is in the driving seat of those solutions. Those solutions, if there's a solution, it's going to have to come from the outside. And it worries me to have to rely on the Saudis becoming more secular. I mean, I don't trust the Saudis for one iota, for 1 second, right? But it's possible that they do become more secular. They do go on this path. And that they use their money to break up Hamas because Hamas is bad for business for them, and they don't want it in the Middle East anymore. So that would be an alternative solution. And maybe Israel cuts a deal with the Palestinians in the West Bank and gives them autonomy, or integrates them somehow into Israeli society in a one-state solution, which is, I think, not a bad solution long term either. So, I mean. If once Israel takes it out of its own hands because it won't do what's necessary, it's the whims of, we'll see how the future evolves and what happens and what particularly happens in the Arab world.
Do you think there's a reason some of the other Arab countries don't like open their doors to, I guess, the Palestinians? Like why they don't accept them? Like why can't I mean, like I guess one of my initial thoughts was like they could just pay them. They could like literally pay all the Palestinians for their land and just tell them to leave.
Yep. That would be a solution. The problem is nobody wants them. And nobody wants them for a simple reason. Everywhere they've gone, they've created mayhem and chaos. So before 1970, from 67, there were a lot of Palestinian refugees in Jordan, and they had massive refugee camps in Jordan for the Palestinians. And they just created havoc in Jordan. And it was just a disaster. And the Jordanian government in 1970, you ever heard of an organization called Black September? Black September was a terrorist organization that committed a lot of terrorist attacks in the 1970s. Anyway, they were named after September 1970. It was Black September for the Palestinians. And that's when the Jordanian military went into the refugee camps and basically kicked out the Palestinian refugees, told them they had to leave. Jordan didn't want them. And they basically decamped them and forced them out. And all those Palestinian refugees went to Lebanon. And they arrived in Lebanon, and they settled in the south part of Beirut. Many of them settled in the south part of Beirut, in big refugee camps in the south part of Beirut. And within a year, the Lebanese civil war broke out. And I don't know how much you know about the Lebanese civil war, but it was brutal, disastrous. It turned Beirut, which was one of the most beautiful cities in the world, it was called the Paris of the Middle East, into a war zone. It was completely destroyed. And South Lebanon was occupied by Palestinian terrorists throughout the 1970s, which meant war with Israel ultimately. It's just that the Palestinians to date have just been they've just been a problem. They brought violence and destruction with them. And look, the Egyptians have their hands full with the Muslim Brotherhood, which there was a free election in Egypt, won the election. So now they have to rig the elections to prevent the Muslim Brotherhood from winning. And the Muslim Brotherhood are extreme, radical Islamists. The Egyptians also have their hands full with ISIS and Al-Qaeda elements in the Sinai Desert that would like to overthrow the Egyptian government. So they're fighting radical Islam already. They don't want Hamas. They don't want more radical Muslims. That's Israel's problem. The Egyptians do not want them. That's why they've closed the border. They won't have a single one of them cross over. And who does want them? Nobody wants them. Saudis don't want them. Jordanians, we know, don't want them. Syria is not a state. It's still in a civil war. The Lebanese don't want them. Certainly, Tunisians, Algerians, Moroccans don't. I mean, where are they going to go? Now, Biden wants to take a few of them in, I hear. But, that's a joke. And the numbers are going to be small. And Americans will never accept it. So where are they going to go? There's no way for them to go. So, it would be a neat solution if Egypt just said, you know what, we'll settle them all in the Sinai Desert, and Saudi Arabia cut a big check, and they built a city in the Sinai Desert, maybe beautiful place by the Red Sea, and they settled them all. But nobody wants to have them on their hands. They're troublemakers. And then if they attack Israel, does Israel then respond by attacking Egypt?
Yeah, I guess that was my next question. If someone does take them, will they stop attacking Israel? And then if they don't, who do they retaliate against?
Exactly. So there's just no easy solutions to this other than to crush them and to re-educate them and to get them to the point where they accept. Look, this is the thing. People can debate history all they want. They can debate forever. This people stole from that people. That's history. It's finished. It's gone, right? Israel's not giving up the land. Israel's not going anywhere. Israel's there, right? That's a reality. And then, so if you have to really evaluate the situation, all you have to do is look at Israel. And what you see when you look at Israel is a civilized, westernized, technologically advanced, free country that any one of us would be happy to live in. Tel Aviv's like a city I think anybody would feel at home. And it wouldn't matter if you were a Jewish, Christian, Muslim, if you were gay, all of that. You would feel very at home in Tel Aviv. It's very Western cultured, and it's a pro-life culture. And they're the good guys. And then you look at the Palestinians in Gaza, and if you're gay, they throw you off buildings. And if you're not Muslim, particularly if you're Jewish, they kill you. If you're Christian, you're second-class citizen. And generally, it's completely authoritarian, totalitarian. They had secret police. Everything was monitored. And the school books are teaching the worst kind of anti-Semitism and the worst kind of hatred possible. So just on that basis, one side is good, one side is bad. One side is civilized, one side is barbaric. That is, you know, the kind of society you create, you build, tells a lot about who you are and what you are and what your moral values are and what our moral estimation of you should be. And everybody looks at what the Palestinians have done in Gaza and say, we don't want that. And they're right. They don't want that. So unless you change the Palestinian mindset towards civilization, which means towards individual liberty in one way or the other, nothing will change.
There's one other topic I wanted to at least address, and it's the West Bank. A lot of people talk about settlers, settlements. For people that aren't really aware or know what those are, can you kind of describe the dynamics in the West Bank?
Sure. So the West Bank, again, was taken over in 1967. You know, Israel made it clear at that point that, you know, Eastern Jerusalem was going to be part of Israel. It's one unified city. They weren't going to split it up again. But the rest of the land there was, for a long time, not much was done with it. But again, here's the interesting question. When Israel occupied the West Bank, most of the land in the West Bank was owned by nobody, by Jordanian government, right? Just like any other place. And when Israel occupied it, it now belonged to the Israeli government. The rest of the land belonged to Arabs, private citizens. So Israel decided at some point in the 1970s that it would be strategic for them, in order to defend Israel, to build, you know, settlements, to build villages, places where people, Jews lived, in strategic locations around the West Bank, so that they could help defend Israel if there was an attack from Jordan or from within the West Bank itself. So they built settlements, but particularly in the Jordan Valley and around the Jordan Valley and in other places. All of those settlements in those days were built on government land, on land that had been Jordan's and now was Israel's, was not private land. Then there were some cases in which Jews bought land from Arabs in the West Bank and built homes and built settlements there. And that's just a private transaction, and I don't see anything wrong with that. I'd say the one area where it's bad, where it's wrong and should not be allowed, is when the Israeli government takes land by force away from Arabs, private Arab citizens, and uses that land to settle Jews. I think that's wrong, and I think that should be reversed, and that land should be returned to its proper owners. The problem in Israel is that part of the people, most of the people, overwhelming majority of the people who settled in these settlements, have been religious zealots on the Israeli side. These are people who believe that this land was given to them by God and they have a right to it. And even if they have to kick out every Arab there, and if they have to take the private land of the Arabs, they should, because God gave them this land. And so they're very collectivist. These are not nice people, not good people, not people that, you know, I associate really with the way Israel was, should be, and can be. But they're a real voice in Israel, and they're a growing voice. And they can be really nasty to the Palestinian neighbors, sometimes murderous. Usually when they are murderous, the Israeli justice system takes care of them, but probably not consistently enough, probably not rigorously enough. But look, here's the thing about the settlements. The Jews, let's take the more legitimate settlements built in government land or built because, by the way, Arabs don't sell land to Jews anymore, because any Arab caught selling land to Jews is killed, right? No trial, nothing. They're basically lynched on the spot. So no Arab will sell land to Jews anymore because enough of them were killed. They won't do it again. It again tells you something about the culture of the Palestinians. But here's the thing about settlements. whenever there's talk about a Palestinian state, one of the conditions that the Palestinians place on it is that all the settlements be dismantled and citizens get out of there. The same thing happened in Gaza, right? Israel dismantled all the settlements. My view is, if that's what they want, they don't want peace, right? If they really wanted peace, they would say, oh no, we love the settlements. The settlements are fabulous. They bring jobs. They create economic activity. We want them to be part of the Palestinian state. Indeed, if Jews want to emigrate to our little state, we'll take them because they bring economic opportunities and they're entrepreneurial and they build factories and stuff. The day the Palestinians say that, we embrace the settlements. We want them in the Palestinian state. We'll keep them, because they create jobs and they create economic prosperity. That's the day they want peace. That's the day they've been civilized, if you will, and they are embracing Western civilization. As long as they want the settlements dismantled, they are a racist and they are committed to the genocidal agenda that they're committed to today, which is to kill all the Jews or to kill them or put them on boats and send them who knows where. That is their agenda. That's what they believe in. That's what they want to do. The real genocidal mentality and the real genocidal agenda is on the side of the Palestinians.
I mean, like, what do you think? I mean, I guess what you just described, that endpoint seems so like far away. Like, what do you think they would have to? What do you think would have to happen to get to that point?
They'd have to be Westernized, right? They'd have to become Western. And I know that's the multiculturalists are flipping out, but look, Western civilization is the best civilization in human history. It's the best civilization we got. It's a civilization that brings peace and prosperity. Only time in human history we had prosperity is when Western civilization built on Enlightenment values prospered. And what all of the world needs, Africa, Asia, Russia, they all need to be Westernized. And so do the Arabs, and so do the Palestinians. And what will that take? A couple of generations with the proper educational system? I don't know. Is it possible? I think so. There's nothing that suggests Arabs are more primitive than anybody else, right? Inherently, they're not. I'm not a racist. I don't believe they cannot become as Western as any other people. If you look at all the immigrants to the United States who've come from all kinds of horrible countries, they all became Americans, and they all were Westernized. They all embraced American values. That's what has to happen to Palestinians. They have to embrace American values, the values of the founding fathers, the values of the Enlightenment, the value of Westernization. And I believe every human being is capable of that. It's more an issue of, do they want it? And I can't control what they want or don't want, but we can create as good an environment to convert them as possible. And the best environment to convert them is an environment where they've just lost, they're on their knees, they get that they whatever they did before failed, and they're looking for something new. And then you come to them with the West, with Western civilization. You come to them with the Declaration of Independence and the writings of the great Western authors. It is not true what they teach in American universities, that all cultures are the same. It is not true what they teach today, that all cultures are equal. Some cultures are superior by what standard? By the standard of human life, by the standard of human flourishing. By that standard, the West is better than anywhere else. And the West is weak today and failing today because the West is abandoning the West. The West is abandoning its own ideas, its own principles, its own, ideal.
Yeah, when people make that statement to me that all cultures are equally good, I just respond, there are definitely cultures you don't want to live in, and you definitely are the best off in this culture.
And the reality is, pretty much every single culture in the world, if you take away the elements of the West from it, sucks. Is a culture you do not want to live in. So even cultures that are different than the West, that are decent, they're decent because they've been Westernized. So if you go to South America, it's a different culture than America. It's decent because they've accepted certain principles of the West. Like representational government and like property rights. And these are Western principles. And like the value of individual life, right? And limited government. And if you go to South Korea, it's a different culture, but they're very Western, very Western. They've accepted Western values. And in spite of the fact that there's a difference, you can tell you're not in LA, you're in Seoul, South Korea. But they also have a deep respect for individuality, individualism. They have a deep respect for property rights. They have a deep respect for peaceful coexistence, and they have a deep respect for representational government. So, these are countries that have been westernized. It's not about a race. It's not about a color skin. It's not about a geographic area. It's about a set of ideas that fit human life. They're consistent with human life, all human life. And it's just a question of people need to realize it and adopt it. And if they do, they win. Everybody wins.
I guess on a personal note, I'm curious, well, what caused you to leave Israel in the 80s?
Israel's very collectivistic. I'm not just secular, but I'm an individualist. In Israel, everybody thinks they're your family. Everybody thinks they're your relative. Everybody thinks they have a business in your business. It's a very, very I found it very claustrophobic, in a sense that everybody's in your business. And I love, so that's one. After I read Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, I basically said to myself, I only got one life to live. You want to make the most of it. Where in the world can you live where you have the most opportunities to live the best life that you can? And the answer, at least then, was obvious. And that was the US. There was no doubt about it, that there were more opportunities here, that it was freer, that you could do more. It was bigger, it was more interesting, it was more exciting. So I did what I encourage everybody to do. Figure out where the best place on earth for you to live is and go there. Forget about where you were born, forget about what language, forget about all that stuff. You've only got one life, don't waste it. So make a list. And maybe it's Tibet, well, probably not Tibet because that's Chinese, but maybe it's Nepal or it's New Zealand. Do it, or at least try it. Go there and try. But too many people never leave their hometown. Too many people stay in the place they were born because they have some kind of mystical loyalty to it. The only loyalty you have is to yourself in the future, and it's to your own happiness. And figure out what will make you the happiest and go do it.
Any other questions, Al?
Well, I think we're coming up on time, so I think this is probably a good stopping point. But Yaron, it's been a pleasure. I just want to say, and I've heard you speak just some of your lectures and just on your podcast quite a bit, and I think you speak with a very a clarity that is very refreshing, and I'm very happy that you were willing to come on to the show with us.
Absolutely.
And I guess just if you want to, plug yourself of where people can find you or how they can reach out to you.
If you don't mind putting these links down there in the description. I mean, I have a channel on YouTube, so just plug my name on YouTube and you'll find my channel. And I'm on Twitter, which is really the only social media platform I'm really engaged with. So Twitter and YouTube. I've also got a website, yaronbrookshow.com. Hopefully you guys can subscribe to my YouTube channel and help me grow that channel.
Awesome. Absolutely. Well, with that, please reach out to us at brothersonbooks@gmail.com for any book recommendations, or if you'd like to be a guest host for a particular book you have in mind. A great review or rating on whichever platform you're listening to this would be greatly appreciated. And lastly, if you can think of any friend, family member, or coworker that might like this episode, please pass it along. I am Jack Allweil, and with me, as always, is my brother, Alex Allweil. Al, what are we reading next time?
I think we are finishing the personal MBA, which I was a little slow to read.
Yeah. So that's what we got next time. Yaron, thanks so much again.
Thanks, guys. Been a pleasure.